Now it might seem unusual for a video titled "Why We Need a Good Battlefield Game" to be immediately greeted by footage from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Yeah, I can already hear the pitchforks being sharpened from some members of the community, and the simple reason for it is that the more and more I've played Modern Warfare 2, the more I just want a good Battlefield game. Now that isn't to say that Modern Warfare 2 doesn't have its own merits. The reason I've played it so much is because I do enjoy it. But there's been a lot of small things that have gradually niggled at me and gradually made me more and more dissatisfied with the game, which was already fixed in past Battlefield games. But unfortunately the recent titles just haven't appealed to me. Battlefield 5 never quite clicked. It had some changes to the gameplay, but a lot of them just didn't quite work. 2042 had some amazing marketing and I was really excited before the game came out. It felt like it was going to be the return to enjoying Battlefield all the time. But despite my optimism from the open beta, the game just never managed to capture my attention or my imagination. And so over the time I've just continued playing Call of Duty amongst other games. But when playing the Ground War mode in Modern Warfare 2, it's just highlighted to me that whilst it's fun, it just doesn't have the polish of that combined arms all-out warfare you get in Battlefield, and there's just so many small bits of polish it's missing and so many aspects it just doesn't seem to have considered in its design. It is kind of a hollow copy. It's fun in its own right, it's been very handy for completing sniper rifle camo challenges, but it's never quite scratched the Battlefield itch because there's been odd things that have been wrong with it. You find that in Ground War the objective flags are captured and lost so quickly. It's almost pointless fighting over them. Yes, they grant you a spawn point for your team, but you're rarely going to keep one for more than a minute. You never get that tug of war of choosing to defend an area from the enemy. It just seems to turn into a big Benny Hill sketch. And it creates a complete lack of focus on the objectives, which means that most players, myself included, just use this mode as a way to use sniper rifles and use those long range engagements, which then means it's very difficult to use any other weapons because if you dare try and go from one flag to the next, you're going to be hit by a sniper rifle bullet. That being said, the bullet physics on sniper rifles are considerably easier in Call of Duty because of how fast they travel, and the hitbox for a one-shot kill is very lenient. But it does mean that the game mode very much revolves around sniping and counter-sniping the other players, which becomes quite repetitive. And this lack of variety isn't helped by the fact there is only one game mode, so you really have only one specific playstyle for this mode, and then there's just oversights and lack of polish. Why is it that when you are killed you're just greeted by a black screen for an arbitrary amount of seconds? It changes each death. You just get greeted with the screen, it just ruins the fluidity of the experience, and it's frustrating. If you just lost in an intense little fight and you want to try and get back in the action, you just sat there waiting, staring at a blank screen. You don't know if your game's crashed, you don't know if it's just the game behaving strangely. You're just waiting for the menu to actually pop up again. And that being said, when the menu does pop up, trying to navigate between the flags on console controller is so difficult. And as you can tell, these things have gradually just worn away at me. It's a fun mode in its own right, but it just doesn't have the polish or the ideas that Battlefield had behind it. It doesn't quite live up to that gameplay I'm really looking for. Plus, the game just really has lost its identity. Modern Warfare 19 was so grounded and gritty when it came out. It was such a return to form for Call of Duty. And within 5 years, the game has completely lost its identity and it's basically become a Barbie dress-up twitchy movement shooter, which is not what I want from a game that has always been linked to being a military style game. And it's just gradually made me want to play Battlefield again. But as I've said, 2042 just never quite grabbed my attention. And to go and play the games I love, like Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4, Battlefield 1, requires me to go back to older consoles, which I'm not that keen into doing, especially when I've got other games I can play with my mates. So in this video, I want to go through a lot of the design decisions and design concepts within Battlefield that made it so good, because I feel like they've maybe not been understood as well, or perhaps just been overlooked in the design of recent games, and just offer some constructive criticism as to how you can recapture the magic of games like Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 for the players. And because it will cover a wide variety of topics which are all linked together, the video will be split into chapters if you would prefer to skip to one specific concept within this video. But anyway, let's get started. Well, there is no better way to start than with what I consider to be one of the most important concepts when creating a game, which is the tonal consistency. If your game has a specific theme or a specific idea, it needs to stick to that. It needs to have a clear identity for players to connect to. It's such an important part of the player engaging with your game, and losing that or breaking that will firstly break the immersion, and it just starts to make players apathetic towards your game. And it really influences player behaviour in a bad way if you mess this up. A lot of past Battlefield games have had single players, which have had mixed receptions. In my opinion, Battlefield 3 was a fantastic single player. It was grounded, it was gritty, and it told an interesting story with some interesting character motivations behind it. It was quite short, but I did overall enjoy the story, and it really put me in the world of the game, and it gave me something to mentally connect to when I was playing multiplayer. Battlefield 4 for me had a pretty poor single player. I found it very uninspiring. It had some okay character development, but overall the gameplay just ruined that single player. Battlefield 1, however, was a complete change of narrative structure with the war stories, and the stories they told were quite good. Through Mud and Blood and The Runner were the highlights of it, although some of the stories were very short and some of the gameplay design wasn't ideal. Battlefield 5 brought this structure again, and it really kind of screwed it up. The main problem was a huge overemphasis on stealth within the game. But the game did drop an absolute beauty of a story in The Last Tiger, which honestly is the best war story they've ever done in that narrative structure, and quite possibly maybe even the best campaign that I've played in Battlefield, despite the fact it's only about an hour long, which told an incredibly engaging story from the perspective of a German tank crew, without demeaning them, without criticising any of their ideology. It was really well done and perfectly executed, and the ending was phenomenal. The Last Tiger was absolutely top tier narrative writing, despite the fact it was so short. And 2042 looked like it was going to carry on this possibility of a really good narrative behind the game. They'd already revealed before the game came out it was not going to have a single player, but when they released the Exodus short film to try and show players the world that they'd created and the world they would be playing in, it was a story concept that caught me by surprise, but was also really interesting and had a lot of potential. A war completely fueled by environmental catastrophe and millions of displaced people, which became a militarized faction trying to fight for their survival against two superpowers on the brink of war. It had so much potential there, and this short film was fantastic at building that world. You could see the effects of the environmental catastrophe already, and the return of Pekowski and Irish from Battlefield 4 was such a beautiful nostalgia hit for players. It really got us excited because it was also a really interesting character dynamic between them. They were on opposite factions, but it was so true to their characters from the previous game. It was clearly very well written, and the overall narrative of that short film was fantastic, and it really built up excitement, and it allowed players to connect with the world they were creating. But unfortunately, they never followed through with it. But at the very least, that short film and the opening cinematic for the game make for a very fitting tribute to Michael K. Williams and his performance as the character Irish. Truly, this narrative could have been so special if it had been allowed to continue. But unfortunately, this is where you start to lose some of the tonal consistency between the storytelling of Battlefield 2042 and the multiplayer gameplay. When you look at the Exodus film, when you get to the first encounter where there's an intel trade, you can see the area is flooded, there's cars strewn everywhere and debris all over the place, and it's a dark and grungy sort of world. And then you get to the multiplayer, and everything looks pristine, it looks clean, it looks like a factory floor in NASA or something. It's a very, very well kept and well maintained world, and it's completely at odds from the world that they were creating in the story. Now, they have done some work to try and address that and try to make it feel like an actual battlefield that you're fighting over, but ultimately the design decision and the art direction of multiplayer just was at odds with the storytelling, and it just makes it harder to get invested in the world. You don't really feel like you're involved in it or immersed in it because it's arguing with itself, and this is where tonal consistency becomes such a big problem, because very quickly you're breaking the immersion of the player. And as soon as you do that, the player becomes apathetic towards your game. And another key aspect of breaking immersion is the appearance of your soldier within this type of game. To its credit, 2042 for the most part has been very well themed with the cosmetic options for your characters. They all do fit the theme of the game, And while some of them are a little bit wacky, they don't quite break the immersion. They do still seem plausible within the tone and theme of the game. Now, to switch gears and compare it to recent Call of Duty entries, and wow, this is where it's really been going downhill within Call of Duty, because it has just become hyper monetization of every celebrity and IP just so that they can get some wow star power, and they are basically just trying to compete with Fortnite, even though it's a completely different style of game. Fortnite is a wacky battle royale designed to capture a very young audience and be very accessible to everyone. Call of Duty, from its inception, was always intended to be a sort of military style game. It started out covering World War II, then went to Modern Warfare. It then lost its identity in the 2010s, came back for Modern Warfare 19, which felt fantastic. It was so nice to see it go back to that grounded and gritty roots. And then again, within the last 5 years, they've gone and pushed it further and further and further. And you've got these neon pink celebrity skins, footballers, and you've got all of this bright neon vomit all over your screen, and it breaks the immersion. It completely ruins the story of the game. You no longer feel like you are a soldier within the world of the game. You go around the corner, you kill 2 or 3 people, you feel like you're doing well, and then all of a sudden you get someone bunny hop around the corner in a neon pink skin, and it's like, what am I actually playing? It just completely ruins the experience. And again, it's because it doesn't match the tone of the game. The game has lost its identity because they haven't decided on a direction for it. They've just tried to please everyone, and it's pleasing no one. And the reason this is such a problem is because of the effect it then has on the player base. Unfortunately, within the last several years, games have been started to be played by a lot more people as though it is their job rather than a game and something to have fun and something to unwind in. It's led to a lot of people claiming that games are just becoming too sweaty and too difficult because players seem to have unlimited amounts of time to play it, and it raises the skill required for a normal player to have fun, someone who's got a job, or someone who has even less time to play the game. And the problem is that when players are having a bad session, when they're getting killed by players who are taking the game way more seriously repeatedly, when they feel like they don't have a chance, when they've been cheesed by the latest meta strategy, or they're getting sensory overload from the combination of these players' playstyles and the absolutely ridiculous character skins they're wearing, it really demotivates the player to continue because you've taken them out of the world by ruining that immersion. If you were to compare it to a game like Apex Legends, yes, it's an incredibly sweaty game and players seem to have a ridiculous amount of time to invest in it. But at the very least, the lore and the story behind the game matches the gameplay. It feels coherent, so there is something that at the very least unites your player base to a common narrative, and so even when you are having a rough session, you can still have something to focus on. You can still make some stupid jokes about the lore in the game. There's still stuff to talk about with your friends. There's still something to enjoy, even when the game is seemingly telling you to log off for the day. And so when you break that tonal consistency, when you break the immersion for the player, it just ruins that. And it means instead of players finding their own fun, they leave. The reason I don't play Warzone is it just doesn't grab me. I don't want to get killed by the latest meta-hugging sweat lord all the time, because there's no coherent narrative between the story of the game and the actual gameplay for me to follow. And I don't care. I'm apathetic towards the game. And it causes many casual players to leave because they don't feel like their time is valued. They don't feel like it's worth investing time into the game. And from then onwards, it's really down to whether players find your game fun as to whether you retain a player base, which could have been avoided if you just kept the tone of the story and the gameplay consistent. Now I accept, boots on the ground is a very vague statement for this chapter, but you'll notice as we progress through, it becomes a much more precise statement regarding this particular critique. Because after the last 10 years, one of the more popular trends in first-person shooter games has been the movement shooter, and this has really been popularised originally by the Titanfall franchise, and it definitely has its merits. Within Titanfall you have all the advanced movement, and it was challenging. It added a huge skill gap and skill ceiling to the game. It becomes a little bit alienating for some players who can't quite master the movement. But as a player learns how to get more speed and start to chain momentum, it completely changes the navigation within the game and it turns into a different game. It's so much more fun when you realise you can grapple slingshot across the map, or you can use a stim to start chaining wall runs and just completely bends the navigation of the map to your fancy. It becomes a really engaging and enthralling experience, which is just designed to make players excited when they hit a cool clip, because they're now finding the best way to maneuver around the map to get into their next fight and hopefully do something awesome and feel like a superhero. And so it's also then fed into its successors like Apex Legends. But it's also started to slowly bleed its way into games that once again were designed as sort of military and grounded style games, which has also led to more annoying behavioural side effects within players. In older Battlefield or Call of Duty or insert X game, movement was about moving from one fight to the next or one objective to the next, preferably without getting shot so that you can keep in the action and keep playing and hopefully win the game. But the traits of movement shooters, where it's all about chaining momentum or just using lurch mechanics to give your character sudden accelerations, has meant that movement is no longer about trying to move around the map and try and get from one fight to the next. It's become this weird minigame of making your hitbox and player model as erratic as possible to bait out shots from other players to then shoot them whilst they're reloading. And effectively the counterplay to this is either you get really good reactions and aiming reflexes, or for players like myself who are never going to be that skilled, it's to not shoot until they stop moving. So then all of a sudden, a first-person shooter game has turned into a game of not shooting. Where has this come from? This has become an annoying behavioural side effect. Especially in these military-style games, it becomes even more frustrating. These are the ones that are supposed to be shoot the enemy, capture the flag, win the game. But again, these behavioural traits are bleeding into these games. And again, it's breaking the immersion and splitting off from the tone of the game. If the game is branding itself as a military, grounded style shooting game, why does it have sliding in it? Why does it have bunny hopping mechanics? Like, it doesn't need this. It ruins the immersion, and once again, it takes the player out of the world and generates apathy towards it, because it's not got a defined tone, it doesn't have a defined vision, and it becomes very frustrating. You'll notice in the old Battlefield games, the movement is way slower, it's way simpler. You can sprint, you can crouch, you can prone, and you can jump. Some of the newer ones then had slides, but they weren't too egregious because it wasn't allowing you to chain momentum. You would come to a dead stop. And you'll notice, especially if you were to go and watch videos like the Battlefield Top Plays by Big Mooney, in those older games, good movement was about knowing where to position yourself, how to get to that position without getting shot, knowing when to sprint, knowing when to have your gun ready. That was what defined good movement, was always making sure you were in the right place at the right time and you never overexposed yourself to getting flanked or taken out from long range. That was what the pillars of good movement meant. The movement in these games just felt slower and weighty. Your character felt like they had presence within the game. You look at games like Battlefield 3, your character heaves a little bit, there's a little bit of head bob movement with every action. When you want to go from prone to the crouch stance, you can't aim down sights, you have to have one hand on the ground. It makes your character feel like they are properly interacting with the world and they are actually a part of it. It makes complete sense with what the player is seeing on screen, and it just immerses them within the world. It makes sense with the tone of the game. Whereas when you look at a game like Modern Warfare 2 or even 2042, where it's got these slide mechanics and it does allow you to chain momentum where you go from a slide into a jump or a slide into a sprint, it just makes you feel like your character is floating. It doesn't feel like you have any weight or, again, presence within the game. You're just this arbitrary superhuman navigating this arena that is supposed to resemble the real world. And it just breaks the immersion. It ruins the experience. It has split off from the original tone and message of the game, and it generates that apathy I've been talking about. And if you compare modern movement systems to a game like Hunt Showdown, which is by no means an old game, but is at odds with a lot of the big AAA games because it has a very slow and very simplistic movement system. The player can sprint, they can crouch, and they can jump. That is all they can do. It's very simple, there are a few controls to learn for it. There is no spamming movement to chain momentum. Your character can move at a max speed. You can do odd little jumps to try and preserve momentum around a corner, but it's never going to give you an advantage in a fight because the player that has their gun ready will kill you quickly time to kill has a huge influence on what the players will do with the movement in the game. And with the sound in the game being so important and the movement being slower, it means every decision you make feels important. It means that you are engaging with the world, because if you decide to run quickly to get into a fight because you can hear two hunters in a duel already, you might be risking running into a stationary player's ambush. You might be risking alerting everyone to your presence. You might risk triggering one of the AI to aggressively push you and start ruining your plans. And it just means the player is immersed in the world because their decisions are interacting with the world in a logical way that fits the tone of the game, and it has consequences. You are seeing what has happened based on your decisions, and it's so enthralling and immersive, and it makes you feel like you are there. It makes you feel like you are experiencing the Bayou for yourself, because your character is properly interacting with the world in a way that does not break the immersion for the player. It does not seem impossible, it does not seem fantasy, it makes you feel like you are part of the game, and that is crucial to making players care and making players enjoy the world of your game. And whilst it's always common for game developers to follow the common trend, follow the hype, it's overlooking one of the key pillars of game design. You do not need fast movement in a first-person shooter to have a fast-paced experience. Your level and game mode design is far more important than your movement, because that dictates where the player can go, how they can get from A to B, and how quickly they will encounter another enemy team. The level design is so much more important than the movement system within the game and the movement mechanics. If you think back to Battlefield 3, you've got Rush on a map like Grand Bazaar. It's one of the more linear maps within the game. But you never felt like you were bored. You never felt like there was nothing to do, or you were taking ages to get from fight to fight. There was always action just around the corner, and you always knew that you were just one good move away from having an insane play and getting to get behind the whole team. That was a fast-paced and engaging experience, and it didn't need any of these spammy, fast-paced movement shooter mechanics that you see in newer games. Or look at a game mode like Operations. There were some huge distances between some of the objectives, but the overall scale of the mode and focusing the attention of both teams on those specific objectives made it feel fast-paced. You never felt like you were out of the action, and it made you feel like you were in a proper battle where your actions had consequences and that you had an influence on this battle you were participating in. The level design and the game mode design dictated where players were going. It focused the action, and all of a sudden you've got a fast-paced experience without spammy, repetitive, immersion-breaking movement mechanics. It was all about the level and the game mode. Now, removing these modern mechanics will make the movement significantly slower, mostly because players can no longer rely on spamming the same 2 to 3 buttons to basically evade all incoming gunfire. It makes the game less mobile, which allows for way more emergent gameplay scenarios to take place, perhaps where you've taken an objective and you need to remain fairly stationary to hold off a wave of incoming attackers. You don't get that when you've got these super fast movement mechanics, because they'll just spam these movement buttons to get round you before you can react, and then all of a sudden you're surrounded, and it's just completely unnatural, completely immersion breaking, and it just ruins the flow of any game mode. It's no longer about how you get from A to B, it's just been about how quickly someone can press the same 2 or 3 buttons. Yes, there is a skill gap to mastering such mechanics, but if you're just pressing the same 2 buttons all the time, that's a crutch, that's spamming, that is no more skillful than chucking grenades at random, in my opinion. In a more slow movement game, players who do move well and do think methodically and understand when to move quickly and when to take it more cautiously will be rewarded. Players that can aim well will also be rewarded, because they will still be able to outgun a less mobile player if they have less gun skill. So it doesn't remove the skill gap, it just focuses the experience on what the game was trying to sell you in the first place. A military game shouldn't have people bunny hopping or slide cancelling or drop shotting or jump shotting. It should be grounded. You want to feel like you're in the world and part of a battle, not in this weird arcadey arena of people zipping around at Mach 5 and jumping all over the place. You need to decide what game you're creating and make sure it fits that tone. And in my opinion, for a game like Battlefield, it needs the slower movement. Make it so that every decision you make matters, because that way you feel like your character has presence in the world, and it makes you feel like the decisions you're making are having an influence. And that is imperative to immersing the player within the game, because it means that they can feel like they have a presence within the game's world. Now, destruction has always been synonymous with the Battlefield franchise, but as it's been clear to see in more recent games, the destruction's been getting toned down and down each successive game. And whilst I mean no disrespect to the development team, I feel like this is where the brilliance of having destruction in the game has been forgotten or not properly understood in the recent titles. The main principle that makes destruction so good and makes it so engaging for players is it gives them a presence within the world at all times. If you look at a game like Rainbow Six Siege, which is a modern game that has really shown what destruction can do, the reason it works so well is that even if a player goes into the building and dies, if they broke one wall, that can have an influence on the end of the round. That could make the difference between your team losing the round or having an angle to kill the last remaining defending player, or vice versa. And it's those small moments that mean even if a player has been dying repeatedly and in any other game would just be feeling like they'd wasted their time, suddenly feel a sense of accomplishment because they have contributed to the outcome of that round. Maybe it was for the better, maybe it was for the worse, but the player is seeing the influence of their actions and it is engaging. It makes it more exciting for players because it gives the players so much more opportunity to make a cool play, or perhaps lose the round for their team. That's the give and take of online gaming. This dynamic of your actions suddenly having consequence enables so many more emergent scenarios. Perhaps you're playing Rush in one of the older Battlefields, you're sat in a building with the MCOM trying to defend it, all of a sudden the wall next to you explodes and you've got enemies trying to flood in. That is a really intense moment and it's unscripted. If those players hadn't had that rocket launcher or that grenade launcher to break that wall open, that wouldn't have happened and they'd have had to come through a door. It just gives you so much more ability to access the level and to change it to your advantage or perhaps your detriment, that the player is always feeling engaged, they've always got options and there's always something they can do. It just creates so many moments that you don't get in a game that doesn't have destruction, because all of a sudden the choices players can make are very reduced and it becomes a much more linear experience as to how you could get into that building and capture that objective. And then in a slightly less formal sense, it's just fun to break stuff. In the real world, if you go and break something, you might get a momentary bit of satisfaction, followed by the instant regret of, why am I such an idiot? Why did I break that bowl? Oh god, I've just spilt milk all over the floor. This is terrible. Why has this happened? I'm feeling awful about myself. In a video game, it's fun to break stuff because it doesn't matter. It's just enjoyable to hear all those breaking noises and see things explode in front of you. It's engaging, it gives you a sense of satisfaction, and it just immerses you in the world. Again, your actions have consequences. The players can see their actions having consequences, and it allows them to learn, it allows them to enjoy it, it allows them to do some crazy things. Perhaps you blew open a wall and killed 3 people. It feels awesome, and it just enables all of these moments that would otherwise not happen in a game that has limited or no destruction. And that's why it was so key to the success of the old games. It enabled huge visual spectacle, but also deepened the gameplay so much more and made the player so much more engaged in the game, even if they were getting ruined and getting killed repeatedly without getting a kill themselves. They always felt like they had something to do, and they always felt like they had at least some small influence on how the game was progressing and the outcome of that game. It immerses the player, and again, it makes them care about the world because they feel like they are part of it, and that is so important in keeping players' attention and keeping players coming back and being excited about your game. Now, with a lot of the changes I've been suggesting and the comparisons to games that I've included, you might be thinking that I'm asking for Battlefield to suddenly become this hardcore, tactical, mil-sim style shooter. But that isn't the case at all. Battlefield has always thrived on its casual accessibility. Combining simple combat mechanics with the complexity of the battle that you are fighting in within the game has always been the game's strength. Because yes, an individual firefight is not very complex. You try and shoot the bad guy, whoever aims best or whoever is channeling the most cheese wins. That is the nature of the combat in this game. But the scale of the overall battle is what gives the game an overall narrative and makes it so much more complex. Yes, you might be having a fight over the D objective, but if your friendly squads are then losing A and B, your team is starting to lose the battle. You've got to have an awareness of what your team is doing but also what the other team is doing. Maybe the enemy team is really bunkered in on the C objective. Yes, you could go and spend half the game trying to clear them out, or do you spend your time defending the other objectives to force them to come to you? You've got all of these emergent scenarios if you are paying attention to the game. And this is where the game thrives. Maybe you've got an objective on rush which you're just trying to force your way through. You've got the option of trying to sneak around, take out a few enemies, distract their attention to allow the main wave of your team to push in and capture that objective. That was something that was just so exciting about that kind of mode, and in operations you get those same sort of gameplay moments. And that was what was so exciting in Battlefield, is you always had that opportunity to make an awesome play like that, as long as you were paying attention and focusing on the action. And unfortunately, in 2042, there's a few too many distractions which is stopping players from getting into the action and spending too much time in menus. The main crux of this is the specialist system. There's no argument that this was introduced to try and sell microtransactions. If you've got characters, you can make the characters look in certain ways, you can sell skins for those characters. Simple logic. The problem is, having the characters with their own unique gadgets. Firstly, it threw off the balance of the game because they kind of disbanded the class system. They've had to reintroduce it, but it was still not quite what it used to be. But the problem is, unless you're a player who likes to play one character all the time every single game, you start to get lost in all of the gadgets and what each character does. You might have been going around playing as a medic, trying to revive your squad and keep them in the fight, but you just get destroyed over and over by this tank. Okay, it's fine, I'll go and play Liz. She's got a special guided rocket that only she can carry. It'll try and help us take out this tank because I can fire rockets at it from behind cover. Great. Damn it, I just got killed by an entrenched squad while I was trying to get behind cover. This squad's going to be really difficult to take out. I'll go and play Zane. He's got the Airburst XM25, which is really good for sending explosives behind cover, and it'll clear that team out. Ah no, my squad's all died. I need to play a medic and start reviving. And you just get lost in this spiral, is that every time you want to do something, you've got the wrong character for that scenario. And it's very distracting from the overall game. When you just had the 4 classes, you were willing to just play that role. It was a role, not a character and not an ability. It was you are doing this for this purpose. Maybe you wanted to play with that weapon type and that guided which class you were playing. But fundamentally, you have a set role within the game, and it's very simple for the player to follow that role and have that influence on the game and on their team. As soon as you start introducing character-specific gadgets, it starts to become a distraction. It starts to become, oh, well, that gadget would be nice for this scenario, so maybe I'll play that character. Oh, but then I might need that gadget. And you start getting in this spiral and keeps on going and going, where unless you decide, okay, screw it, I'm just going to play this character for the rest of time, that will simplify it. And that point, then what was the point in having specialists in the first place? You might as well have just had the classes to begin with. And secondly, you've then also got excessive weapon customization. Battlefield 2042 isn't the worst for this. The weapon attachments are still fairly simple, although the varied ammo types is where the game will start to become confusing. And the point is, when you look at Call of Duty, yes, it has so many options for customization, and whilst they fixed this problem in Modern Warfare 3, for the last few games, you had no idea what the weapon attachments were actually doing unless you wanted to scroll through spreadsheets, go through countless mountains of YouTube videos, never know exactly what each attachment was doing to your gun. And it just leads to this endless cycle of max minning and just meta breaking. When you could just be playing the game, you could just be going out with a gun with some attachments and just shooting the bad guys, which is what the game was supposed to be, not an XL max min challenge. And so reining in some of this customization is a huge thing to just simplify the game. Get back to the action, get back to just shooting other players, trying to capture the flags, trying to deal with that pesky tank or that helicopter that's killed you 45 times. That's what you should be focusing on, because that is what will give you the emergent scenarios, those epic moments, the Battlefield moments that we've been craving and that the marketing team wants us to think we'll have every game. But ultimately, those were always developed organically because players were focusing on the game and not the menus. Yes, you can have customization, it's no problem at all, but just don't make it the focus of the game. Make it an extra. Make it that, oh, maybe you want to have a longer range scope. You can put a longer range scope on your gun. Oh, you want a grip to make your gun more stable. That's fine. Just don't go down this endless max minning route where you constantly seem to have to go outside of the game to understand how to play inside the game. That is just ridiculous. And again, ruins the experience because you're having to spend more time thinking outside of the game rather than just playing the game and enjoying the game well. It takes you out of the world, and so all of a sudden you're developing that apathy I've been talking about the whole way through this video, and as soon as you develop apathy, you no longer care about the game and you no longer want to come back. And that's part of the reason that 2042 has never really grabbed me. Yes, the plus system where you could change your attachments on the fly was a cool idea, but again, it's another distraction from the combat. If I took a medium range scope and got killed in close range because I couldn't aim well enough, then that's on me for not positioning correctly and not moving around the map and navigating correctly to suit the weapon I've brought. That is a far more satisfying way to die in the game than to be killed because I was midway through swapping my attachments, or oh, because I thought I needed this ability but I needed that ability instead. It's far more satisfying to lose because you didn't play well enough than to be losing because you're distracted by all of these things that are in menus and not actually in the game world.
Enemy destroyer, careful!
Now, the movie pun aside, sound is for me one of the most important aspects of game design and immersion. It is integral to making the player feel like they are in the world of the game. Battlefield has always been known for its visuals. It was for a while also known for being one of the best sounding games out there. But for me, that is no longer the case. It's no longer the A standard for sound, and it kind of feels like a bit of a downgrade from some of the previous games, and almost feels a little bit forgotten in terms of the emphasis it used to carry in Battlefield 3 and 4. In those games, the sound was so immersive. You could almost feel the force of the explosions going off around you. The vehicles had immense presence, and the weapons you felt powerful. It gave you that power fantasy that a lot of people look for within these games. And it made the player feel like they had a presence in the world, and everything else around them happening also had a presence and place within the world. It just completely immerses you with the sound. But in 2042, the sound just feels flat to me. It just doesn't have any of the drama or engagement that it had in the older games, and this was never more apparent than when I was playing in Portal on a Battlefield 3 server, using some of these guns that were iconic to me, but they just didn't sound like they used to, and they didn't sound right. It just didn't feel as engaging. The echo that you get after each shot just feels quieter. The explosions feel muted and like puny. The ones in Battlefield 3 and 4 felt like a proper concussive blast as the explosion came out. And it just made everything have much more of a presence. I mean, just listen to these comparisons of the weapons in Battlefield 2042 Portal compared to the original ones in Battlefield 3.
C4's been planted. C4's lowered.
For me, there's just no comparison there. Battlefield 3 has so much more drama to it. It feels so much more engaging, and you feel so much more connected to the world. The ambient sound within the levels also just adds that immersion. Hunt Showdown is the gold standard in my opinion for audio design. I mean, just watch this clip with headphones on and tell me that you don't feel like you are in the world of the game. The ambient sound of the insects, the sound of all the AI monsters, the sound of your feet sloshing in the puddles. It feels authentic and real to the world you're in, and it just completely immerses you. At no point when I play Hunt do I feel like I am not in the world of Hunt Showdown. It is such an immersive game, and even though its hardcore gameplay means that I don't always want to play it because I don't always want that tension, the reason I keep coming back to it is because no game puts me in the world like it does, and no game has that same tension and has that same connection to your character because of how well it integrates the player in the world. It's just phenomenal, and it's why sound is so important, as well as animation. You see in Hunt, all of the animations are slow, they feel weighty. You go for a melee attack and it feels like your character has put their weight into it. Every weapon reload feels like you're actually interacting with a proper object. Every player movement action feels weighty, it feels like an actual person moving. The same was said in older Battlefield games. Your character and your soldier felt weighty, they would heave about a little bit. Every weapon felt like it had weight. If you were carrying a light machine gun, the animation made you feel like you were because of the way the character was heaving with it. You got all the little bits of camera wobble when explosions went off, and it made the movement feel as good as the third-person animations look. Now in 2042, the third-person animations look fine, but in first-person, the animations just look weightless. It makes it feel like your character is just floating around the level, and when you do the tactical sprint, the way your character arbitrarily holds the gun vertically, regardless of how heavy that weapon is, just makes it look like it's a toy. It just doesn't have any kind of weight or interactivity behind it. It breaks that immersion once again. And that's why sound and animation is so important in these games. The sound for me is the most important of the two. But if you have great sound but animation doesn't quite match with it, then it breaks that immersion once again. Keeping that immersion is so crucial because again, it keeps the player engaged in the world and it makes the player care. And with 2042 being a Battlefield game, it does have its share of cool moments. I mean, there was definitely some visual spectacle in this base push. But does it really have the same amount of drama and just full-on engagement as this moment from Battlefield 3 on the Aftermath expansion? For me, there's just no compare. The older games had such great sound behind them. It made the player feel engaged in the world. It made them feel like they were properly interacting with it, and that everything around them was actually lethal. Everything was a danger to the player, and it just gives you that little bit of tension, and more importantly, the immersion. It makes you care about the world, and it makes the cool moments that much more special because you really felt like you were there in that moment. And that's what gaming thrives on, is just giving players cool experiences that they can't have in the real world. And if your sound isn't up to par or the animations doesn't match up to it, you're going to break that immersion and players won't care. Now, I imagine a lot of people are seeing this as the final chapter and thinking, why wasn't this right at the beginning? This is the thing that has irked us the most about the last few Battlefield games, is bugs at launch, in missing features, and the games feeling generally incomplete. And I would agree with you, it is a hugely problematic point for the franchise, is that the games have been releasing feeling incomplete and not ready for public release. When you get into a game and you don't have a scoreboard, like, what? We've had that feature in first-person shooters for like 10, 15, maybe even 20 years at this point. Why don't we have a scoreboard when the game releases? Why is the game releasing in a state where a lot of players can't play it because their game runs at stupidly low frames per second? Why are people's games crashing all the time? Why wasn't this tested? It becomes immensely frustrating for players when they've got this game that they were so excited for, they were so ready to get invested in the world of the game, have those awesome moments, and it just doesn't work. The game is not functional, it's not ready, and it's just missing the features they want. You can't get a second first impression. You can fix a buggy game. An incomplete game will always irk players, because you'll be playing catch up before you can expand the game. And by the time you've caught up, you've then missed out on releasing content that could actually keep players engaged in the game, and your community is fractured. The things that Battlefield really needs to make sure it has when it does its next game, it needs to make sure things as stupidly simple as a scoreboard are present in the game. Bring back the server browser. Whilst I understand the matchmaking has been very quick and very robust in 2042, the reason a server browser was so important was it allowed communities to develop and curate their own experiences within the game. In the peak of Battlefield 3, you had servers that would run Conquest and Rush on different maps, and you'd have these different game modes. It had this great variety where you would go from map to map, from game mode to game mode within the same server, and it was a really enjoyable experience. And what's more, when you start to find these servers you like, you start to recognise certain players. Perhaps you'll befriend them, perhaps you'll get a rivalry, and those little things create those stories that make players so excited and so nostalgic for your game, because they've got those memories that they attach to it, and you just can't script that or make that happen without having these tools to allow the community to drive the experience of the game. I understand the argument of not spreading the community too thin. If you've got too many different versions of the game, you end up with the DayZ problem where all the communities want different things. They all think that their community is the most important or the most numerous, or it's the one that they care about the most, and then you start to get community infighting. You don't want that. But having these tools to actually allow the community to interact with each other properly and actually form these bonds or these rivalries, or just find these experiences that they all like and thrive, is nothing but good for your game, because you also start to understand how the players are enjoying it, what they like about it, which will then help you develop new content for the game that might appeal to them even more. You get some great modes that have been released after launch, but these can be curated even further when you understand what your community wants and what your community is enjoying about your game. Perhaps it'll help you identify bad behaviours that you want to dispel. Maybe certain communities have found mechanics that you can abuse, and it allows you to fix them. You don't get that if you don't allow the community to curate their own experiences, and removing things like the server browser was crucial to that. And what's more, you need to make sure the menus in the game are easy to navigate. 2042 has not been the worst for this, but when you look at Call of Duty games of recent, my god, the menus are an absolute crime against humanity. You've got pop-up after pop-up, you've got to press several buttons just to see which of your friends are online, who's in your party, and it's ridiculous. But all these menu transitions for no apparent reason, and it just becomes so difficult to navigate. You need to make sure that these things are simple, because again, the focus should be on getting the player in the action and having them play the game, because then they'll want to keep playing it and not want to spend all their time trying to figure out your menu system. And then once you've got all of these things ready for the launch, you also need a stockpile of content after the game is launched. If you're running a live service, you need to have that content at least ready, or 90% ready, so you can keep the player base engaged. Unless you have a huge amount of content at launch, which could keep players going for like 4 to 6 months, you're going to struggle to keep their attention, because eventually they're going to be playing the same thing over and over again. And depending on whether you've listened to the previous feedback on why destruction and movement and sound is so important to engage players in the game, if you've perhaps not followed all that guidance, you'll need this extra content to keep people caring. So unfortunately, all games are now having to force content out at a stupidly fast rate. You don't necessarily need to be releasing content every week, but if players can expect at a regular interval of time to have a new thing come into the game, some new content, a new level, a new weapon, or perhaps a new expansion, because that was a format that was so successful in older games, it will just mean that the players are always remaining engaged and always interested in the world you have created. And having that will mean that there's so much more goodwill towards your game, because players have always got something more to look forward to. They aren't sat there complaining all the time about everything that's missing from your game, because they're just enjoying you expanding it and giving them more to do. And once again, that gives you the main thing that the investors are looking for, which is that engagement time. But you won't get the engagement time, firstly, if the game isn't engaging, if it doesn't bring you into the world, and secondly, if the game is incomplete or buggy or just missing features. It won't capture players' imaginations and attention if it doesn't have those things. And this is why I really want a good Battlefield game. All of these things that the old games did already were what made it brilliant. It was such a brilliant concept, and it was so engaging and so exciting to play. And it just seems to have been forgotten, and that's such a shame, because it is still brilliant and there is still so much space in my gaming time to play a game like this. As long as it feels right, as long as it immerses me and it makes me feel like I'm part of the game's world and I can have those cool moments and something to get excited about. And that's something that unfortunately 2042 didn't do for me. And with Call of Duty getting further and further away from the identity it recreated in 2019, I really would like a casual military style game that I can just sink my teeth into and just have some casual fun in, rather than just waiting to get slide cancel bunny hopped by the latest wannabe sweatlord, because the casual games have been dying out because players are just taking them too seriously. Battlefield always has a special place because it's difficult for one player to influence the game for an entire team, and it's why we all want a good game. Just please take the time to actually make it a good game, because we'll all come back, we'll all want to play it, because frankly these moments really are only in Battlefield.